Humanity Matters.
Oh, welcome back to History Repeats. I'm your host, Liam Carballal. This is hmTV. Joining me again is Richard Acritelli. Richard, how you doing?
Liam, how's it going?
Can't complain. Richard, we were just talking before camera started rolling about your museum. Things are going well. You were mentioning a Korean War exhibit and Vietnam War exhibit, World War II exhibit.
Yeah, we have a couple of exhibits. Most of it is American, right? And American soldiers. A lot of the local stories that become national because these guys go overseas, thousands of miles away. But we do have some stuff from the other side, the enemy side.
Yep.
We have this unbelievable propaganda poster of all of a sudden like Vietnam's a utopia and stuff like that. So that got framed today and that got put up. We also have a huge Japanese flag that we put up today.
Like
howitzer
from an actual battle?
Oh, yeah. And then we have the translation of another flag on the other side. We have two sides of this museum of we'll see in the afterlife, and we have the actual translation of it. So they did believe in the afterlife, and it's crazy. At Iwo Jima, they would have to kill 10 Americans before they themselves could get killed. And then the kamikazes and Bob Feller, a great pitcher for the Cleveland Indians, could put a baseball through this wall here, right? I mean, even we have a lot of brick here. I think he'd be able to, he was a fireballer. He was some fastball. And so somebody called him a hero. A year later, after the war, he won the Cy Young Award. So the guy was out of baseball for 3 years. Following year, he was the best pitcher in baseball. Yeah. And he was in destroyer duty in the Atlantic and then in the Pacific. Yeah. And he goes, I'm no hero, I'm a survivor. There's a big difference. So it's kind of like the Holocaust Museum here, right?
Yeah.
You have survivors say, I don't know why I survived. It was a matter of luck. I was in the right place at the right time. There's no rhyme or reason why I'm here, and there's a million other people not, wherever I was, right? And some of the veterans feel the same way as well, that, they saw some very heavy fighting, and, a lot of times they thank their lucky stars they were in, one spot rather than another. There's a man that I knew, John D'Aquila. He liberated Mauthausen concentration camp.
Yep.
He entered Europe right around, literally at the same moment that the Battle of the Bulge was happening, like a week, 10 days before Christmas, right? And or it might have been a little bit less time than that, but maybe at least a week, right? And he slept on a dead cow in France to stay warm. And then what you see is you see a lot of these battle maps that have different colors and stuff like that. And they're usually like the division of the army that they're fighting with, right? So he's going to go from his entrance point in France, which was, I think was the 11th Armored Division that he was in. It's definitely one of the armored divisions that are here, because a lot of times the armored divisions were the ones out front.
Yep.
And like
Patton's third.
Yeah, Patton's Third Army, and then the divisions that are tied to Patton, right? And the 7th Army as well. That came up the back door of the Mediterranean and then headed towards like the Swiss-German border, and then made that right turn into Germany itself. So the 7th Army might have been the one that might have gotten into Dachau. John D'Aquila is going to end up going from the Battle of the Bulge, then the Hergon Forest, and then that brutal fighting in January, February, March. And then as they're going straight into Germany, a lot of the American forces headed southeastern. And Patton could have liberated Prague,
Yeah.
And he was told to stop because the battle lines are already drawn, right? And Patton goes, I could go in here right now. The Germans are literally killing the Czech resistance.
Yeah.
The Soviets purposely, like they did in Poland with Warsaw. Yeah, our supply lines are too long. We don't have enough food. All this, it was like all a bunch of nonsense. They were having each other do their fighting for them. In terms of the Germans, okay, in terms of the resistance. They were both killing each other. And so John D'Aquila, very bright guy, he never thought that he was going to survive the war. One of his friends died right next to him. Yeah. He would talk about his friend, 60 years, 70 years after the war. And then comes Mauthausen. So he goes into Austria, beautiful countryside, the mountains. The thing with Germany and Austria was it was very resemblant to the United States in terms of you had a strong middle class. The people were proud of their homes. They had heat and toilet paper. If their houses got wrecked, they were out there the next day cleaning it up.
Yeah.
So Americans were kind of saying, what are we doing here? These people look like us.
Hitler declared war on us. We didn't.
2 days later, right? And his own general said he signed our death warrant for us, right?
Yeah.
So if you look at who were the two major groups of immigrants, were the Germans and Irish.
Yeah.
Right? So Americans are like, what are we doing here? Right?
We're fighting for these British people?
Well, they so we know the Nazis are bad, but the average soldier did not know about the atrocities that were committed against the Jews from 1933 when Hitler takes over all the way up until that point. You had farm boys from Iowa and Nebraska, city kids from New York City. The Great Depression was a huge cover to not say support, but to basically help Hitler a little bit. Why? 25% of the people are unemployed. Yeah. People said that might as well be on a different planet. We're not going to help. We're isolationists. We did that once already, and so on. We're handing out rakes and shovels during the Civilian Conservation Corps. Germans are fighting in Spain. The Japanese are fighting in China. So they already had a generation of hardened citizens that were moving in that direction, right? So now you get these hardened Americans, and Hitler's going to end up coming out and saying that there's no way the American boys of democracy and capitalism could defeat National Socialism, could defeat the SS and this and that. He might have been correct in 42 and 43. The only reason being is that we were just getting our feet under us. Yeah. We're like a boxer. We're looking to get like ready and get used to the fight, which was completely different than what we had seen in 1918. Okay, and General Bradley said it. Omar Bradley said it the best. We looked at the Germans and the Japanese. We had to learn how to walk before we could run. They were ahead of us. Somewhere after Sicily, we end up surpassing the British. Our Navy is stronger than the British. Our military, we're moving in that direction, right? So now you get these hardened soldiers that go into, I believe Ohrdruf was the first camp, and there's a picture of Eisenhower right behind this wall here with this look of disgust on his face, right? Yeah. What I always want to know is about the intelligence. Remember, what is it? Maginich was liberated, I think it was July of 44. The SS couldn't destroy the crematoriums and the ovens and the facilities. At Sobibor, they planted pine trees there, right? So it's crazy, right?
Now, these are death camps. These
are death camps. You have Belzec, Maginich, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Auschwitz.
And these are taken by the Russians.
These are taken because that's in their sphere of influence, right? Yes. So the difference is that these are concentration camps that we're going into. They were death camps at that time because of where they were located in Central Europe. That was the worst place to be in Europe at that time. Because what the Nazis would do, the SS would do, is like out of Auschwitz, they took something like 58,000 people out of there. And it was a death march. If you didn't move fast enough, you got shot. Okay, and they left 7,000 people behind. Werner Reich, who did a lot of speaking, and he was in 4 camps. He was in a camp in Yugoslavia, Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, and then Mauthausen. He lost a couple of his toes to frostbite. So you kind of think like if the Germans just would have left, but they knew the people were witnesses, and they're still using them almost as poker chips, right? Yeah. And they're moving them into central Germany away from the fighting itself. So in the spring of 1945, at this point, typhus is running rampant, starvation. The Germans, it wasn't like they were really feeding the people that much, but there was still something that was given. Yeah. They figured the calorie ratio of what somebody needed to survive is crazy. At this point, now they're worrying about their own hides, right? Yeah. Patton's moving quick. He's moving in. The British are moving in towards the north. The British actually went to Denmark, which I believe was in the Soviet sphere of influence. And they said, there's no way we're going to allow the Soviets to take this country, right? So they kind of rushed there. You had people in Belgium that were starving, so it's a crazy time in the war because it's just about done. And you have guys like John d'Aquila who's going to say, we were at the broken edge of a bottle. We didn't know if we'd ever be able to go home again, right? So now he goes into Austria. The war's come to an end. The Germans are on the Autobahn, and they're marching west because they don't want to be taken by the Soviets. And what ends up happening is now there's this smell. And there's no rhyme or reason to the smell. You just know it's not right. Within about a mile and a half of Mauthausen, they start smelling this. And it's just not, it's not something like your mom cooking an Italian dinner, or you going to the bakery, or, you're in a restaurant, like it was a Szechuan place where they're cooking in front of you, right? Yeah. It's something that's familiar, right? This was something that the guys knew, the soldiers knew, it was not right. So Mauthausen, I believe, was liberated because they were looking for bridges in the area. Yeah. They kind of stumbled across it. Some of the camps, they were told...
Across the Rhine?
Yeah, well, they were so far now across the Rhine.
I think it's more like
I guess once they got beyond the Rhine is when they started running into those camps like Buchenwald and Ohrdruf and Dachau. The British go into Bergen-Belsen, right? And they go crazy in Bergen-Belsen. They break out flamethrowers and they start, going through this stuff because they don't understand how one person could do this to another person. Yeah. This is cruelty and torture that nobody could ever imagine. Actually, and so on. Right?
I have a quote from the Liberation of Buchenwald here.
Who is that? Morrow? Edward Morrow?
This appears to be just one of Patton's officers. This
is
a biography of Patton. He says, the sight of dead men does not affect the writer of this article, as during the last 2.5 years, he has seen many, in fact, too many. But the sight and stench of these living dead, because this is exactly what they were, was entirely too much for his stomach to stand. No race and no people other than those which are strictly sadists could commit crimes like these.
Now, Patton was our best general, right? He's our pit bull. He's going to start the bleeding or end the bleeding, right? Patton was an odd figure. Maybe a lot of it was him, but a lot of it was his times and maybe who he associated with. He was anti-Semitic. Yeah. But the head of his intelligence, a guy named Oscar Koch, a colonel named Oscar Koch, was Jewish. Yeah. He was racist, but his orderly was black, and he was a pallbearer for him. Yeah. Okay? He was against Catholics. His son-in-law was Catholic, and then Jimmy Totten, he became a major general. So when you look at Patton, he's going to end up saying, you would never know how beastly these Germans could be, that these camps. He throws up behind a shack in Ohrdruf. Ohrdruf was a relatively new camp. Yeah. Because somebody asked me once how many concentration camps were there. I go, I don't know. Because you have so many sub-camps and so many factories and this and that. Heck, Berger the American concentration camp for 350 American soldiers, of which a lot of them were Jewish, right? And this was how crazy the Germans were. They grabbed all these people. They said they were Jewish. One of them was a Mexican-American who was a medic. Like they said that there was no rhyme or reason we were taken.
Yeah.
Most of them were Jews, but there was other people they thought were troublemakers or might have looked Jewish and this and that. They worked in the mountain, and they inhaled the toxins, which all coal miners would call like black lung disease and stuff like that. And there was no cover, there was no nothing. So when somebody asks about the concentration camps, you could say the big ones, even the secondary ones. But there was a whole network of these. And there's an interesting story of a German kid who was like, he was curious about what was going on in this facility. Yeah. And he was caught outside the barbed wire, and the guard said, "Don't ever come back here again, or you might end up in here."
Oh boy.
So you had people that just, some of the people at that point definitely knew what was going on, right? And they couldn't hold that. I mean, think about the 1936 Olympics, Berlin Olympics. Okay, that's Berlin. You have the world comes to Germany. The first concentration camp was set up in Dachau in 1933. And then that's going to grow from there into different parts of the country. So, the deception that the Germans had, they were very strong at, but they could not keep it totally under wraps. The last major Jewish population to be somewhat intact with a Hungarian Jews, right? Wallenberg was a Swedish diplomat. He gave these Schultz passes. They were all like in Swedish and they looked official, but it was like gibberish. It wasn't really anything that was really official, but the Germans couldn't really understand it, and they knew that he was a diplomat, right? Well, the American War Relief, Institute or office, they gave the Swedes all kinds of money and see if you could save this population, right? So what ends up happening is a year later, John d'Aquila is going to go into Mauthausen. He's going to come across many of those Hungarian Jews. A lot of those Hungarian Jews made it across Hungary and into Poland. And Auschwitz was actually slowing down in 1944. The trains, less and less trains, fewer and fewer trains were coming in. That's why Birkenau, they revolted. Okay, the Sonderkommando, those guys, they knew that their time was marked. And that if one group of people that was going to go, it was them, because they could testify on everything. From the moment people entered the camp to what was told to them, the deception, and so on. Some of those people ended up in Mauthausen. So d'Aquila goes through the town. One thing about the Austrians is that they always said that some of the Austrians were the best Nazis. All right, remember Hitler was Austrian. The country through an Anschluss, you have other countries that do support Hitler. The Croats was at the Ustashi, I think it was. They were so out of their minds. The Germans even told them to calm down. If you could imagine that, right? So, I mean, that's the irony of it, right?
Yugoslavia.
Yugoslavia. I mean, but if you were a German staff officer and you drove into the Yugoslavian countryside, you're probably not coming back. Okay, because Marshal Tito and they knew those mountains and the Balkans and stuff like that. The partisans and everything. So d'Aquila goes into Austria. He goes into Mauthausen. It was this huge concentration camp that was up on like a hill. It was elevated. And what ends up happening is they go in there, and I think the prisoners had taken over the camp, and the Germans realized that everything was done. So there was like a transfer of power. And John d'Aquila, who was a medic, goes in there, and right away he ends up starting to try to save these people. But the thing is, Americans are overcome by this. Your bodies stacked like cordwood. Your people, just like the verse that you read there, the paragraph that you read, that's a universal line. because Americans are going into all these camps. One thing about Americans, very well-rounded people, like, you know, you have a lot of the Holocaust survivors, when they meet Americans, that's one of the first things they remember about liberation.
Yeah.
We met these Americans, they were in good shape, they were strong looking, they you know, they wanted to fight, they wanted to get in here, and they wanted to end the war. And they'll always remember that. And then when they come to this country, they remember the moment that they step foot, because it's almost like a sense of normalcy, right? You know, and those are things that we don't necessarily see in the museum behind us. We just, we most of it is just a horror of the Holocaust, right? So John D'Aquila, he was in Lower Manhattan directly after 9/11. And this was 55 years later.
He remembers the smell.
The smell came back to him.
God.
So he goes, you try not to remember that smell, but when it hits you, he goes, I was a kid, you know? So one of the people that he liberated was Werner Reich. And Werner Reich and John D'Aquila would do some speaking for me, for my students. And Werner Reich would point at John D'Aquila, and he goes, if it wasn't for him over there, I would have been dead within a day or two. He goes, I was laying next to people who were dead because I was getting their food. And he goes, it still wasn't enough. And you know how Werner Reich almost died?
How?
The craziest story. He was a funny guy, Werner Reich. He was a good, he was like, I guess when you see the depths of hell, right? That, you know, you've seen almost everything, right? And he was a very comical guy. He was a funny guy, right? He goes, I see Americans chewing tobacco, but I don't know what it is. And they're spitting it out. And there's like a can of Kodiak or Skoal that's out. And he goes, I think it's food.
Oh, no.
He goes, I poisoned myself from eating this, and my mouth like hits the ground. And he goes, I had no nutrients, no vitamins, no nothing in my body. And he goes, I just about poisoned myself. He goes, I outlived Dr. Mengele only to almost die to a can of chewing tobacco. And he ended up doing a play at Theater 3 in Port Jeff. So if you go down Port Jeff, you know, if you go to the top of the hill, you could see Connecticut, and you got the harbor and the ferry and everything. And Port Jeff's a beautiful town. And you have Theater 3 as you're going down on the left-hand side. It's been there forever. And he used to do a play, I think it was called Out of the Ashes, and it would be his experience of the liberation.
Biographical.
And he would be dressed up in different roles, you know, and so he was a very sharp guy. He becomes a lawyer. After the war, he works for the insurance companies. He goes, I think was it Newbury, Connecticut? He went to Middlebury, Connecticut. He goes to law school. And then, I don't know how, I think they did an exhibit on him at Suffolk Community College in Sayville. There's like an extension site down there. I went down there and I asked for his number, and then we became friends. I wrote about him a couple times in my paper. I brought him in for my students. I teach in-service and graduate classes to teachers. He spoke to them, and people would say, this man is the nicest man. And then I had Werner Reich, the two of them. The only time that you would ever see anything like that now is probably through some sort of reunion and an anniversary date at the liberation of a concentration camp, where you have some of the American liberators that are still able to get over there and the Holocaust survivors. And it's something. At this time, you had American soldiers who survived the war, and now they're going to have more nightmares for the rest of their lives. And then when they came home, they were told, don't talk about it. How the heck do you not talk about liberating a concentration camp and seeing misery at the lowest levels? It just brutal. And a lot of these men didn't say anything. Their wives knew that they had seen some bad things, but they didn't say a word. And there's stories of wives that would hit their husband a certain way when they were sleeping, and they would almost jump, you know. And a lot of times it skips a generation that one older generation who's going through that PTSD won't say it to their kids, but they might say it to the grandchildren. You know, so it's pretty interesting that, you know, something like this could happen, right? And here on Long Island, what do you have two large groups of? Holocaust survivors,
veterans,
and World War II veterans. How do you know the World War II veterans? Because you have areas like Levittown that pop up.
Yeah.
Right? Largest communities in America as a result of the GI Bill. Why Holocaust survivors here? I think because, you know, we're outside of New York City. You have your jobs. You have different ethnic, religious, racial groups. It's a melting pot.
Yeah.
You know, you look at Queens and Brooklyn and Manhattan and northern New Jersey and here on Long Island. People knew that they could come close to groups that they knew of. You know, and you had a lot of European Jews who had families here. And, you know, it's one of those things. If you want to talk about another story in the next podcast, we can get into something with Mauthausen and, you know, another, you know, another story from there. So.
All right. Yeah, I'd love that. All right.
Okay.
Thank you. This has been History Repeats. I'm your host, Liam Carballal. Richard, thank you as always. This is brought to you by hmTV. Till next time.